Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is, well, to give you a shortcut to being incredibly well informed of the landscape of 2025.
Mm.
We're going to unpack the key global issues that are shaping our world right now, and then we'll zoom right in on a really fascinating case study, the 2025 Singaporean general election. Now, you might be wondering, why pair global forecasts with, a national election? Well, 2025 is really shaping up to be a year of profound global shifts, big changes. And Singapore's election, it offers this unique lens, doesn't it, to see how these larger trends, things like economic pressures, new narratives, how they actually play out on a national stage. We've meticulously combed through quite a stack of sources. They offer some surprising facts and some genuinely insightful nuggets of knowledge for you.
Yeah, what's particularly compelling here is how these global currents, economic shifts, rapid tech advancements, evolving politics, they don't just exist out there in isolation. They converge, and you can see their broad impact, but also the really granular detail in something as specific as a national election. So our goal in this deep dive is really to help you connect those dots.
Okay, let's unpack this global picture first then. Our sources, they paint a pretty compelling picture of 2025, suggesting the world is still, well, deeply shaped by the fallout from COVID-19. What are some of those key lingering effects? How are they manifesting globally?
Well, what's truly striking is how these post-COVID shifts, things like deeper national debts, faster digitalization, and this noticeable rise in individualism, they aren't just economic or social trends anymore. They're profoundly shaping the actual discourse within nations. We're seeing a real hardening of old social and cultural fault lines.
You mean like culture wars, that kind of thing?
Exactly, from things some call culture wars to the, algorithmic bubbles on social media that just reinforce these divisions. The key insight here, I think, is that these alternative narratives, they gained a truly destabilizing power in quite a few 2024 elections. You saw it in the US, Pakistan, India, Romania, Moldova, Georgia.
Wow.
Yeah, it demonstrates how a fractured information environment can really disrupt traditional political landscapes.
Okay, so as these narratives are clashing globally, Europe seems to be navigating some particularly choppy waters. Our sources mention weak leadership, fractured parliaments, and the Franco-German engine of European integration, described as feebler than ever.
Right, and this brings us to a really critical point. What does this domestic instability mean for broader European and even global stability? In France, for example, President Macron is essentially a lame duck for 2025. He can't call legislative elections, which really limits his political options. And then in Germany, there's a February election looming, but it's happening amidst an ailing economic model, widespread social discontent, and you've got the far-right AfD party polling second. So the real takeaway here is that when key nations like France and Germany experience this kind of deep domestic instability, it reverberates across alliances, global policy coordination. It has a real impact.
Moving from those internal struggles to, well, external conflicts. The geopolitical landscape shows an escalation in Ukraine. We're seeing reports of North Korean soldiers supporting Russian troops, and Ukraine now authorized to use U.S. ATCMS. Those are the Army Tactical Missile System missiles actually on Russian soil.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how these localized escalations are often symptoms of much broader geopolitical realignments. I mean, consider the unexpected fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria.
Right.
You could argue that was hastened because Russia is so bogged down in Ukraine and Iran and Hezbollah are weakened, and that dramatically shifts the Middle East's balance of power. Syria was, for years, this proxy battleground for major global powers. And now it's entered a completely new stage. It signals a profound rearrangement. The underlying insight, perhaps, is that in these contexts, diplomacy often functions more like a strategic move, a way to gain advantage rather than a genuine step towards lasting peace.
Okay, switching gears to the economy. Our sources indicate a strong comeback for protectionism and austerity measures. We're seeing major spending cuts, tax increases, announced by countries from Brazil and Argentina to Mexico, even the UK, all grappling with big fiscal deficits.
Yeah, this global push for fiscal discipline, even within the EU, it really points to increased economic insecurity and fragmentation. The interesting twist, though, is how countries like Vietnam and Mexico, the ones that benefited from that period of reglobalization as intermediaries in supply chains, they might see their economic models suffer under pressure from, say, a new U.S. administration pursuing more protectionist policies.
Right.
And while interest rates are dropping globally, many low-income countries are still facing really high debt distress.
Right.
That's a looming crisis. There's also that notable proposal from Brazil's Lula da Silva for a 2% annual tax on the super rich, over $1 billion in capital. but the sources suggest it's pretty unlikely to pass, especially with what they call the Trump-Elon Musk entente arriving in the U.S., suggesting powerful resistance from wealthy interests.
Beyond economics, humanitarian crises remain tragically front and center. The sources highlight the worsening situation for Syrian refugees, 14 years into that brutal civil war, and now after the fall of the al-Assad regime.
Yeah, despite hopes for a return, the reality on the ground is just stark. Several EU countries, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Denmark, others are actively suspending asylum applications or even deporting Syrian refugees.
Oh, yeah, supporting.
Yes,
Yeah.
it underscores this powerful global dynamic where, well, fear permeates policy when it comes to migration. It often leads to the criminalization of migrants, portraying them in this social burden narrative by some governments. And then you have the situation with UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Facing a ban from Israel, significant funding withdrawal from the U.S., that's going to be a crucial test for humanitarian action. It'll certainly exacerbate the already dire humanitarian disaster in Gaza. It just shows how deeply intertwined geopolitics, national policy, and human suffering still are.
Okay, let's talk tech. The chip war and this relentless march of hyper-technology are also profoundly shaping 2025.
Indeed. And while new tech regulations might actually slow down a bit in the US and EU, places like South Korea and Latin America, they seem to be moving rapidly in the opposite direction. What's particularly noteworthy, though, is the increased symbiosis. That's the word the sources use between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon.
Symbiosis. How so?
Well, companies like Amazon, Anthropic, Palantir, they're signing big agreements for AI applications in defense. And that hints at a potential obsolescence, maybe, of previous international agreements on prudent and responsible AI development in the military.
That sounds significant.
It is. And looking beyond that, 2025 is actually the International Year of Quantum Science and Technology. You've got companies like Microsoft, Atom Computing, Google with its Willow chip, all pushing the boundaries of computing. This promises, giant leaps in fields from medicine to cybersecurity, but it also raises pretty big questions about future power dynamics.
And perhaps most concerningly, the nuclear debate seems to be heating up again.
Yeah, this brings us to a really unsettling question. How will all these developments impact global security? Russia has approved changes to its nuclear doctrine, basically lowering the threshold for use. Meaning the conditions under which they might deploy nuclear weapons are now less stringent. They've even threatened Ukraine with their Oreshnik hypersonic missile.
One that can carry multiple warheads.
Exactly, capable of carrying 6 nuclear warheads. And the involvement of North Korean soldiers in Ukraine raises new questions, too. What's Pyongyang getting in return? Especially given NATO's concern about Russia possibly supporting North Korea's nuclear capabilities.
Wow.
So this has reignited the nuclear debate in Seoul and Tokyo. Meanwhile, France and the UK are continuing their own nuclear modernization. The UK is even training Australian officials in nuclear reactor management as part of that AUKUI security pact.
So it's really back on the table.
The critical insight here, I think, is that while the world is grappling with climate change and economic crises, the threat of nuclear conflict is re-entering the mainstream discourse in a deeply concerning way.
And finally, on the global front, gender equality seems to be facing increased polarization.
Yes, 2025 actually marks the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and the 25th anniversary of UNSC Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security.
Big milestones.
Huge milestones. But despite that, these anti-gender movements are unfortunately gaining ground. Progress has really stalled in many countries. Our sources note that some countries that previously championed feminist foreign policy, like Sweden and Canada, seem to be focusing more internally now. And there's a general regression noted in Europe. It signals a concerning lack of alternative leaderships and funding for women's rights initiatives globally.
So progress isn't guaranteed.
Not at all. The insight is that even as global challenges mount, the fundamental rights and progress of, half the world's population are not just being neglected, but actively challenged.
And just quickly, looming over Asia, China's growing militarization of its maritime periphery.
Yeah.
That suggests a more aggressive strategy in the Indo-Pacific, raising security fears.
That's certainly what the sources suggest, yes.
Yep.
Increased tensions and security fears across the region are a key factor for 2025.
Okay, now let's bring these global trends down to a national level. Let's dive into the 2025 Singaporean general election. Our sources describe this as the first election under the new Prime Minister, Lawrence Wong. He succeeded Lee Hsien Loong back in May 2024 and was widely seen as a key test of public confidence in his new leadership. So, How did the electoral landscape in Singapore kind of set the stage for this?
Right. So to set the scene, Singapore's system uses single-member constituencies, SMCs, and group representation constituencies, or GRCs.
Okay, SMCs are single seats, right? GRCs are different.
Exactly. SMCs are straightforward single-seat contests, but GRCs are multi-member divisions where parties field teams. And critically, one candidate must be from a minority background. Now, this system has been debated for a long time. Its impact on minority representation and, well, on the ruling party's dominance.
Right.
And the prime minister can advise the president to dissolve parliament early, triggering an election within 3 months. This specific election, the 19th in Singapore's history, was held on May 3rd, 2025. Parliament was dissolved on April 15th. A record 211 candidates contested. And interestingly, the highest number of female candidates ever, 53. That's a notable shift.
That is interesting. Now, before the election itself, there were some significant pre-election activities, things that hinted at maybe internal pressures within the political system.
Oh, definitely. What's particularly insightful about that pre-election period is the sheer number of seats vacated in the 14th Parliament. It was the most since independence.
Wow. Why so many?
Well, it wasn't just routine turnover. It included some really high-profile resignations, one over unsubstantiated allegations, another pair due to an extramarital affair, and then the transport minister, S. Iswaran, resigned after being charged and later convicted of corruption. The first cabinet minister to face such charges since 1986.
That's major.
It was huge, and this series of events became this crucial test of the ruling People's Action Parties, the PAP's stated commitment to high standards of propriety. It forced them to address internal integrity as a major campaign theme. It really highlights how a national election can reflect a society's values when they're under pressure.
Building on that, leadership succession within the ruling PAP was also a significant theme, wasn't it, given the new prime minister?
Absolutely. Lawrence Wong's rise to PM in May 2024 and then becoming Secretary General of the PAP in December 2024. That was a key transition analysts watched really closely. He took over after Heng Swee-keat stepped aside from leading the so-called 4G or fourth generation team, officially citing age and health, though some analysts linked it to the PIP's weaker performance in the 2020 election.
Right.
PM Wong made a notable pledge to field more women candidates, and indeed they introduced 32 new PAP candidates, their largest slate in recent history. Very diverse backgrounds. It really signaled the party's concerted attempt to, stay relevant and appeal to a changing electorate amidst all these global shifts.
Okay, what about the opposition?
Yeah.
Let's start with the Workers' Party, the WP. They're the established voice of opposition, right? How do they navigate this landscape?
Right. The WP, led by Pritam Singh, he was recognized as Singapore's first official leader of the opposition. They faced some ongoing legal challenges regarding their town councils, but those were ultimately resolved in their favor on appeal in July 2024.
Right.
Pritam Singh himself faced charges of lying to Parliament. That trial ended in November, resulted in a fine in February 2025, but crucially, he wasn't barred from the election.
That's important.
Very. The party also dealt with some internal issues, including resignations due to an extramarital affair involving Leon Pereira and Nicole Say. But despite these pretty significant hurdles, the WP declared its intention to contest and win 1/3 of parliamentary seats in the medium term, clearly positioning itself as an effective, constructive opposition force.
Ambitious goal.
It was. They fielded candidates in 26 seats, which was a considerably larger campaign than in 2020. But they made the difficult decision, as they put it, not to contest the Marine Parade Bradell Heights GRC, cited resource limitations and boundary changes. That led to a PEP walkover and got some criticism from other opposition parties. It really highlights the resource constraints and the tough strategic dilemmas faced even by the most established opposition party.
And the Progress Singapore Party, PSP, how did they fare leading up to the vote?
The PSP, founded by the veteran politician Tan Cheng Bok, also saw leadership changes. Leong Mun Wai became Secretary General. They confirmed their key figures would contest the West Coast Jurong West GRC. A particularly tense moment came with a volunteer disruption incident in Bukit Gombak. Altercations between PSP and PAPI's volunteers, police investigations.
Right, Gombak A.
That's what the PSP called it,
Yeah.
Gombak. It really highlighted the underlying tensions and just the passionate nature of ground-level campaigning in Singapore.
Beyond those two main opposition players, we also saw activity from other parties and attempts at alliances. Always makes for interesting political dynamics.
It certainly does. You had the Singapore Democratic Party, the SDP, starting their walkabouts early. They expressed disappointment over electoral boundary changes that saw the disappearance of their traditional strongholds, Yuhua and Bukit Batok SMCs.
Claimed it lacked transparency.
That's what they said, yes. Claimed it lacked transparency. It underscores a common criticism from opposition parties about the electoral process. SDP's leader, Chee Soon-hwan, notably shifted from Bukit Batok to the newly created Sembawang West SMC. Then you had the Singapore Democratic Alliance, SDA, planning to contest Pasir Ris Changi GRC, and splinter parties like the Singapore United Party, SUP, formed by former Reform Party members.
So fragmentation, but also attempts at unity.
Exactly, that constant push and pull. The People's Alliance for Reform, PAR, for instance, founded by People's Voice Chief Lim Teen. It united the Reform Party, People's Power Party, PPP, and Democratic Progressive Party, DPP. But then the PPP withdrew later, cited irreconcilable strategic differences, including their stance on halting COVID-19 vaccinations.
Interesting.
Yeah. And separately, a non-formal partnership called the Coalition formed. That was the Singapore People's Party, SPP, National Solidarity Party, NSP, Red Dot United, RDU, and SUP, aimed at preventing three-cornered contests. But then RDU left that coalition over concerns about multi-cornered contests.
All that irony.
Right. These dynamics really highlight the fragmented and often very challenging landscape for opposition parties trying to consolidate their efforts.
So with all these internal party dynamics, shifting alliances, leadership changes, what were the key issues that really resonated with voters, and how did the campaigning actually play out?
Well, a January 2025 study was pretty clear. Cost of living was the #1 concern for Singaporeans, followed by employment and housing.
Tracks with the global pressures we discussed.
Absolutely. Shows how intimately those global economic pressures filter down to everyday life. Voters also consistently prioritized constituency-level governance and, interestingly, candidate quality. And social media played a huge role. All parties leveraged it. Podcasts also emerged as a new political space.
Podcasts.
Yeah, allowing politicians to connect with voters beyond traditional media. And crucially, for opposition parties, a way to bypass mainstream outlets. It reflects that broader global trend of digital political engagement.
Okay, and the campaigns themselves.
Yeah.
How did the parties position themselves?
Well, the PAP, led by PM Wong, actually acknowledged it was a fiercely contested election with no safe seats. That was a significant admission. They focused on their track record, economic management, navigating profound global change, even addressed past controversies like the NTUC income deal, and they warned against weakening the PAP government.
Okay, and the W.
Their slogan was "Working for Singapore," emphasizing political balance. They claimed 15 of their policy proposals were adopted by the government, though the PIP disputed that.
Right.
Advocated for GST exemptions, drawing from investment returns to address cost of living, criticized the GRC system for giving PIP free passes, urged voters to vote on hope, not fear.
What about PSP and SDP?
PSP's manifesto, Progress for All, called for reverting GST to 7%, setting rent guidelines, housing reforms, claimed the 4G PIP has lost its way. SDP slogan was "Thrive, not just survive." Advocated for GST reduction to 5%, a minimum wage.
Right.
It's worth noting one SDP candidate had to publicly apologize for using a racial slur during a rally, highlights the intense scrutiny in the digital age.
Yeah, absolutely. And other parties.
PPP proposed tighter immigration, proportional representation. PAR advocated for free education, healthcare, school meals. A real mix of proposals.
Now, beyond the standard campaigning, there were also concerns about foreign interference and other incidents during the campaign, echoing some of those global challenges.
Yes, very much so. There were reports of about 5,000 comments from 900 fake Facebook accounts and bots, spreading anti-PP and anti-WP sentiments.
So, disinformation.
A clear indication of digital interference attempts mirroring those global trends, yeah. An online publication, John, was actually blocked for violating election advertising rules, raised questions about online content regulation during elections. And then there were local police investigations, too. Individuals damaging wheelchairs at polling stations, a man allegedly involving children in distributing PP flyers. These incidents, while varied, just underscore the complexities of maintaining electoral integrity in this increasingly digital and, well, polarized environment.
Okay, so after all that campaigning, all the controversy, the global backdrop, What actually happened on polling day, May 3rd, 2025?
Well, the PAP retained its supermajority, secured 87 out of 97 seats, and notably improved its popular vote share to 65.57%.
An improvement, okay.
Yes. The Workers' Party held all 10 of its incumbent seats, and they secured 2 non-constituency member of parliament seats, those NCMP seats.
Right, the ones for the best performing losers.
Exactly, to ensure a minimum opposition voice. This meant the WP replaced the PSP, which lost its parliamentary representation entirely.
Wow, so PSP out completely.
Completely out of parliament. And voter turnout, interestingly, at 92.83% was actually the lowest since 1968.
Lowest since 68. That is interesting. What do you make of that?
Well, it's a data point that suggests potential shifts in voter engagement, maybe sentiment. Hard to say definitively without more analysis.
How did the parties and leaders react to the outcome, especially given that lower turnout?
Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, he described the results as a clear and strong mandate, signaled public satisfaction with the PP's continued governance. President Tharman Shanmugaratnam commented on the absence of the kind of political distrust or polarization you see in, say, Canada or Australia, suggested a unique form of stability in Singapore.
Okay, and the opposition?
WP's Pritam Singh pledged a more balanced parliament, continued service, though reports said supporters were disappointed at no new gains. SDP leader Chi Soon called it an uphill battle, called for electoral reforms. He actually launched something called the Orange and Teal Social Enterprise Cooperative.
Yeah.
PSP chief Leong Mun-wei called the results very shocking, said the party would review its strategy. Founder Tan Cheng Bok confirmed his retirement from electoral politics, but said he'd remain with the party.
End of an era for him, electorally at least.
Seems so. And NSP chief Spencer Eng declared opposition unity is an illusion, vowed a more aggressive and vocal approach against other opposition parties.
Oh, interesting turn.
Yeah, and PR leader Lim Teen found the results disappointing for the entire opposition, vowed a stronger comeback, and alleged inexplicable matters with ballot box seals. So quite a range of reactions, highlighting the diverse interpretations across the political spectrum.
And what about international reactions? How was Singapore's election viewed globally?
Prime Minister Wong received congratulations from a really broad range of world leaders. Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, China, Japan, India, New Zealand, Cambodia, Thailand, the US, EU, UK, Estonia, Luxembourg, France, Taiwan, Ukraine, Vietnam.
Pretty comprehensive list.
It really is. This broad recognition highlights Singapore's diplomatic standing and the international perception of the election as, a legitimate and important political event.
Okay. So pulling it all together, what does this election mean for Singapore, and how does it tie back to that global picture of 2025 we painted earlier? What are the key insights for you, our listener?
Right. This brings us to that crucial question. What can we learn about the tension between strong governance and robust opposition, especially in this era of global uncertainty? Analysts offered some differing views, which provide fascinating insights. Some suggested a potential shift towards maybe a two-party system in Singapore eventually, noting that increasingly crowded and fragmented opposition landscape.
But WP didn't gain new seats.
Exactly. The WP's performance was debated. While they did increase vote share in their incumbent constituencies and secured over 40% in all the new areas they contested, they ultimately failed to secure another GRC. This suggests their strong candidates might be, perhaps, overextended. And this outcome keeps Singapore closer to what some analysts call a one-and-a-half-party system, one dominant party, but a consistent opposition presence.
And for the other opposition parties, like PSP?
For them, the results were seen as a serious loss. PSP losing its NCMP seats, decreased vote share. Analysts pointed to factors like maybe overdependence on founding figures like Tan Cheng Bok, perhaps a reduced internet presence compared to before, struggles recruiting younger candidates. The electorate's desire for a slow and steady approach to opposition growth was also noted. Reflects maybe a preference for stability above all else.
So where does that leave things now?
Well, in the aftermath, the WP secured those 2 NCMP seats. Pritam Singh remains leader of the opposition. The 15th Parliament is expected to open on September 5th, 2025, with only the PIT and the WP officially represented. The critical takeaway here, I think, is that even in a system that looks very stable on the surface, These underlying forces, public opinion, questions of integrity, the desire for diverse voices, they are constantly at play, shaping political outcomes.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, right? The 2025 Singaporean election showed a strong mandate for the incumbent party, the PIP, especially in a period of global uncertainty. But at the same time, it highlighted this clear, ongoing desire for more opposition representation, even if it's growing slowly. It's a really complex dynamic.
It absolutely is. And this raises an important question for all of us, really. How does that balance, the balance between a government getting a decisive mandate for stability and the undeniable need for a robust, scrutinizing opposition, like we see playing out in Singapore, how does that reflect the broader global tension between the demand for certainty on one hand and the push for democratic contestation on the other? In this increasingly uncertain world of 2025, it forces us to consider whether this kind of pragmatic face of modern democracy, while certainly stable, maybe risks stifling the very dynamic contestation that's needed to truly adapt to an ever-evolving world. That's definitely something for you to mull over as you navigate the coming months.